On May 14th, Bleeding Cool first disseminated the rumors that Marvel's license agreement to create new comic books featuring Conan the Barbarian was coming to an end. As rights owner, Heroic Signatures went into self-publishing with their own line of Conan and Robert E. Howard books. On May 16th, Fredrik Malmberg, the president of Heroic Signatures and keeper of Conan legend, confirmed the rumors to, on the whole, be accurate, which was immediately retweeted by yours truly. Let's break it down, and since it's what we do here at Midnight's Edge, let's put it into context. In this editorial, I will begin by establishing the changing perceptions of the Marvel Comics brand, how those perceptions might have been a challenge for Conan, and finally, why Marvel and Conan are parting ways. Marvel Comics is an institution, and their original run of Conan comics, from 1970 till the late 1990s, is iconic. The early years of that run is even what directly led to the Milius and Schwarzenegger feature film, as covered in our retrospective of that movie. Without Marvel Comics, Conan would have been a far more obscure character today. When Marvel Comics regained the Conan license in 2019, however, after nearly 2 decades of Dark Horse Comics holding onto it, they were in a very different place. At this point in time, presumably in an attempt to broaden the readership beyond the built-in audience, Marvel Comics had already spent years making some, shall we say, pretty drastic changes to their lineup and to the narrative of their stories. To be clear, the problem wasn't what they were doing, but the divisive way in which they were doing it.
And if you don't like my politics, don't buy my book. Problem solved.
Not only did this not broaden the readership, it caused the built-in audience to positively flee from Marvel Comics. Sales dropped year after year. This, of course, didn't happen just at Marvel. DC did the same thing, with similar results. Namely that the big two today largely have rendered themselves irrelevant, and set the stage for manga usurping the position they once held in the comic book market. Worse yet, their own editorial practices left Marvel with something of a stigma. The prevailing feeling amongst a very large portion of the comic book reading audience was that regardless of the cultural institution they may have been in the past, Marvel Comics today were all about subverting their own characters. Against this backdrop, Marvel regained the Conan license. The key word here is license, because Marvel did not own Conan. Therefore, subverting him the way some of Marvel's own proprietary characters had been subverted in the preceding years was never going to happen, as Conan properties had both stipulations up front as well as approval on every issue. Therefore, Marvel's new Conan stories features a Conan who is the same badass he ever was. And in my personal opinion, Marvel's Conan books have been the best books Marvel Comics have put out in the last few years, bar none. That is not to say that mistakes weren't made, because they were. Conan was relaunched at Marvel Comics with the 12-issue epic, The Life and Death of Conan, by writer Jason Aaron, artist Mahmoud Asrar, and cover artist Esad Ribic. While the story itself is fine and it would have made for an excellent event miniseries published alongside a flagship title, it was instead published as the flagship title. This was, in my view, the wrong story for the flagship title, let alone to relaunch it with. The reason for that is simple. It was 12 issues, in which the story was set up in the first issue and paid off in the final 2. But for the better part of a year between the beginning and that eventual far-off end, readers were treated to the exact same scenario over and over and over and over again in issue after issue after issue, namely a dying old man Conan having flashbacks to past adventures. That formula got real old real quick. Going back to what I said about the changing perceptions of the Marvel Comics brand, many never checked out Marvel's Conan relaunch in the first place due to concerns that Conan 2 would be subverted, or at the very least sidelined, which never happened. The concern was there though, and of those that did pick up that first issue, a substantial portion dropped off long before the storyline concluded in issue 12. New readers were, in my view, strung along for way too long. There were of course many more books, like the Baelith and Valeria miniseries, a brief Savage Sword revival, and the Savage Avengers, which is great fun for what it is. But the main book, the flagship title, didn't find its feet until issue 13. That's when Jim Zub took over the title, and he is the most appropriate writer to work on Conan for many, many years. In terms of getting original author Robert E. Howard, he is arguably second only to the great Roy Thomas himself. Problem was, his run began with issue 13. Not a great starting point for several reasons, but sales-wise, his relaunch was off to a fairly strong start, all things considered. And it was in a great place to build momentum. But then the pandemic hit, and the lockdowns followed. By the time Jim Zub's first storyline could resume, more than half a year after it started, all the momentum that had been built prior to the lockdowns had evaporated, and there was no getting it back, despite a strong storyline. The flagship title thus ended at issue 25, which would have been issue 300 following the original vintage numbering. I had a fairly strong feeling the writing was on the wall already then. As I established before, none of Marvel Comics' titles are really selling, but all of their other titles at the very least are theirs. Conan they have to pay a hefty licensing fee for, and sales being what they are, with Disney corporate suddenly starting to demand some level of profitability. The Conan license is one place it makes business sense to cut. And so, Marvel opted out of the licensing deal at year's end. Capping off this era of Marvel's Conan will be the King Conan miniseries by, once again, Jason Aaron and artist Mahmoud Asrar. And 4 issues in, they're firing on all cylinders on that one. I'll be sure to review it once it's concluded. Conan also appears in the upcoming Savage Avengers, and in the announced upcoming Epic collections reprinting older stories. But that will, pending some proverbial future cameo deal, be the end. For those that may be wondering, yes, that means the Epic collections will be discontinued before their time. I am personally not too upset about that though, as I felt they were botched anyway. The vintage Marvel reprints by their color scheme, and the Dark Horse reprints by following issue order as opposed to trade paperback order. And now, the reprint rights for both revert to heroic signatures. On May 16th, Fredrik Malmberg of Heroic Signatures told CBR, "We had a wonderful run with Marvel Comics, but ultimately they have decided not to extend their license beyond this year. Conan has more than 50 years of comic book publishing. We took the decision to pick up the baton ourselves, not only for Conan but all the other wonderful characters and IP that we control. The publishing program will commence next year, but exact details are not final yet." So, while this marks the end for Conan in Marvel Comics, it does not mark the end for Conan in comics period. Quite the contrary, with the financial muscle of Funcom behind them, Heroic Signatures will self-publish their own comics. Now with full creative control and with full access to the entire Robert E. Howard library. That means Solomon Kane, Cull, Dark Agnes, and everyone and everything else they may wish to use. What they might do, we will get back to. For now, let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.